Hi everyone, and welcome to our second video on the brain. In this video, we are going to cover our brainstem, the diencephalon, and cerebrum. So let's get started. We're actually going to take a different approach in the way we present the brain in lecture than we do in lab, just to kind of keep things a little bit different. So we're pretending we are coming up through the spinal cord. What is the first thing that we're going to hit? Well, the first thing that we look at is this very scary structure, set of structures, called the brainstem. Now, the brainstem has three different regions to it. The inferior most aspect is going to be your medulla oblongata. That's the part that's physically connected to your spinal cord. Then we're going to have our pons, which this is a posterior view, so you don't really actually get to see it, but the pons really has this like pot belly sort of structure. And then the superior most is going to be that midbrain or mesencephalon. So what we're going to do here, we're not going to go through every single structure, obviously, but we're going to go through each region, look at some really important structures, whether they're important physiologically or for clinical connections, or they're going to be important later when we get into different pathways. So that's kind of the three criteria that I have. And that idea of going region and then important structures is what we're going to do for every aspect of the brain that we're learning. So we're going to start at the base of the brainstem with our medulla oblongata. So this is the medulla oblongata right here. Portions of it have been sectioned out. And one of the really important structures that it has is we have these bulges. This is the front part of your medulla, and there are these two bulges and like sort of basically pathways or tracks that we call the pyramids because they kind of pyramid out of the brainstem. And the important component about these pyramids is something that happens in the brainstem that we call the decussation. And we're going to use that word so much when we get to our somatic pathways because you're going to find both ascending and descending, there's going to be a lot of crossing. So all decussation means is we go from one side to the other, and you can see that here. So we come up one side, cross, and go to the other. So we call that the decussation of pyramids. And most of the ascending or descending tracks, depending on where you're at along the pyramid, will cross over. Now within the medulla itself, we also have something called the inferior olivary nucleus. And this actually resides within a larger structure that we'll look at later in lab called the olive. Okay, very noticeable structure. But we have superior and inferior olivary nuclei. The inferior olivary nucleus is in the medulla, and it's going to be important in relaying information about proprioception. So we haven't got to sensation yet, but proprioception is the sensory ability of your body to know where your arms, legs, and head are in space. So this is going to be important in sending that information from the appendage to the cerebellum, because as we'll see later, your cerebellum is in charge of posture and like helping along with a lot of other structures manage your motor function. Now here, just behind your pyramids, we have another band of white matter that will be important later when we get to pathways called the medial lemniscus. This is an important component in our posterior column medial lemniscus pathway, which is a sensory pathway bringing information in about different sensations from your arms and legs. Now, as we move superiorly, the next structure we're going to see is the pons. Now, the pons we talked a little bit about when we got to the respiratory system. So this is where we have that pontine respiratory group. It's also going to be in charge of relaying signals to skeletal muscle from your cerebral cortex to your cerebellum. And this is where the superior olivary nucleus is located, which is important for our hearing pathway. So when we get to our last chapter of the semester, we're going to learn about all the structures of the ear and how sound waves come in activate receptors and send a signal down one of our cranial nerves that's going to pop along different structures, and one of them is the superior olivary nucleus, and it's going to send information to the part of our brain that helps sort of send sensation information to where it needs to go in the brain. Now, superior to your pons is the midbrain or mesencephalon, and this one I like to describe it as it has a lot of nubs, okay? So when you look at the midbrain, one of the structures you're going to notice, you see all these ridges on the outside here of our midbrain. Let me see if I can use a different color. There we go. I can't. Oh well. So these little ridges you see here, those are called cerebral peduncles. Again, these are going to be really, really important in what we call our descending tracts, which is how we send motor information from the brain to the muscles that we want to move. So you're going to see as we go through these pathways in a couple of chapters that we're always going through those cerebral peduncles, and this lets you know where it's at. Now these nubs back here, these four, you're going to see a few others because just in front of this is your thalamus, so it's going to have a bunch of other stuff too. But these four nubs here can be collectively called your tectum or your corpora quadrigemina. So all four of them collectively are your tectum. And they are divided into superior and inferior colliculi, or colliculus for singular. So our superior colliculi here, these ones are involved, we'll get to this again as well in our last chapter as we talk about moving of the eyes and regulating information coming in as well as like coming out. So like how are your eyes moving? How do we coordinate those muscular movements? We also have our inferior colliculus, which is going to be down here, these colliculi, and these are responsible for the startle reflex, which is something, again, we'll talk a little bit more about when we get to the ear as well. But suffice to say, your startle reflex is basically, you've all encountered this. If a car backfires or you hear somebody in the restaurant, the dishes crash, everybody turns to look at that. That's your startle reflex. You hear a loud noise, your brain interprets that as, ooh, that could be bad, and so you observe to see what that is. So that is part of your startle reflex. Now, within the midbrain, and to be honest, within the brain itself, there are a lot of nuclei that have very, very specific jobs. And as you guys are looking through your diagrams, whether it's from the ones I posted or online, other places like KenHub, there's a lot of stuff that we don't get into. So just be aware you're only required to know the nuclei that we specifically discuss. So this is a cross-section of your midbrain. And the two things that we want to talk about right now are the red structure and the black structure. So this black line right here is called the substantia nigra, and it is actually very darkly pigmented. I'll show that to you on the next slide. It is actually functionally connected to a group of structures we'll talk about in the last video called the basal ganglia, which help modulate, again, your movement. Now, what the substantia nigra does is it releases a lot of dopamine. So this is the area that actually is connected to Parkinson's disease, and we'll talk about that a little bit on the next slide. The red nucleus, which is this red structure here, we're going to see that on our motor pathways. This is important, again, for controlling voluntary movement of the limbs. So we're going to learn a few different indirect and direct pathways relating to movement of like your arms, your legs, etc. So this is one of those areas that we're going to be starting that point at. So here is a cross-section of a person with Parkinson's disease. This is their midbrain. And this is somebody that has a normal brain. They don't have Parkinson's disease. If you look, here is the substantia nigra, very darkly pigmented. The person that does not have that much pigmentation, it's almost gone. This person has Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's disease is characterized by a drop in dopamine. And dopamine is really important. It's an important neurotransmitter in helping with modulating your movement, making sure your movements are smooth. They're not gyrating. You don't have these movements that shouldn't be happening. So it has an inhibitory effect as well. So you shouldn't be having these random movements. We don't really get into Parkinson's disease too much in this class. Again, it's a little bit more functional, but I liked to talk about the anatomy, like where in the brain is this sort of coming from? What is the etiology of this disease? Again, more information here about Parkinson's disease if you are interested. All right, so let's just do a quick review of where we have been so far. We traveled up through the spinal cord last chapter. We just hit our medulla oblongata, which again, your medulla is going to have, it's going to have respiratory centers, it's going to have regulation of like heart rate and all these really important things. The blood-brain barrier here is actually a little bit more permeable. And this is also where your vomit center is. So this is where you can have nausea caused by like emetic inputs, whether or not it's like something you ate or whatever, or caused by activity. This is not from motion. So some of you that might get motion sickness from cars or riding in an airplane or on a roller coaster, that is a different set of pathways, but this is where your vomit center is. If you ever have that question on a trivia night, that's where your vomit center is. It's called the area postrema, and it's in your fourth ventricle. We then moved up to the pons, which, like the medulla, also has some synaptic input for various sensations or pathways to and from the brain. And then we had our midbrain, which, as you can tell, it did have a lot of pathways as well, because it's actually like the next step into the brain. What we're going to see soon is that pretty much all of your sensations are going to come to one part of the brain before they go to the cerebrum. And so they're going to have to come up through, some of them through that midbrain and pons. So that's kind of why those structures are located there. So where are we headed? The next thing we're going to talk about is our cerebellum. And we're not going to get into it too much, but there are some structures that we do want to talk about. So again, the cerebellum is the second largest portion of the brain, and we're going to be looking at all of these structures in labs. So you'll really be able to see almost every structure in this lecture in the lab room. Now, the major function of your cerebellum is to monitor your conscious motor function. So if you want your hands to do this, it's making sure that the output is what the input wanted, right? So if you wanted your hands to do this, it's making sure they do that. And it sends feedback to other places of the brain to help modulate the movement. Now, just like your cerebrum, it's going to have two hemispheres, and it has several different lobes as well. We're not going to talk about the lobes in lecture, but we are going to look at them in lab. So we have an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe that are separated by this huge fissure. And then we also have in the middle something called the vermis, okay? And this again is going to help with balance, equilibrium, and motor function. So a lot of times when we think about cerebellum, the major function that we think about is your ability to balance. You can't see, but I promise I'm standing on one leg. So this is where that ability to balance is going to come into play. And what we'll see when we get to our last chapter, when we talk about the sensation of balance, you're going to see a lot of input come here to the cerebellum about where your arms, head, and leg are in space. Now, the cerebellum is also built very similarly to your cerebrum. It has a lot of ridges on the outside of it called folia, and the outer layer is made of gray matter. In the brain, gray matter is where we have integration. It's where we take that information and go, ah, that's what's going on, or let me make a plan to fix something. And then deep within the cerebellum is tracts of white matter. And in the brain, so again, in the cerebrum, white matter is akin to roads. So this is how we're transmitting information, okay? We also have what are called cerebellar peduncles. We will observe these again later. They're important for, again, pathways. And again, we're going to see all of this in class. So let's take a look here. This is a cross section, mid-sagittal section. Here's your pons. Here's your cerebellum. We can see all these white matter running through. That's your arbor vitae. All of the ridges here, you can see them here. These are all ridges called folia. We have our vermis right here. Here's that primary fissure that we'll see in lab with the anterior and posterior lobes. And again, these are important with modulating conscious movements as well as regulating your equilibrium and balance. Now, the last place that we're going to investigate today is our diencephalon. So the diencephalon is the center portion of your brain. So it'd be the area here highlighted in red. And it contains three things that all have the word thalamus in it. Thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. So here is our hypothalamus, our thalamus, and our epithalamus. And we're going to dive into each of these regions and talk about them briefly. So the first one I want to talk about is our thalamus. This is that region of the brain that I mentioned earlier that is basically a relay station. It's like telephone operators back in the day. There were women typically that sat at switchboards, and you would call the operator and say, I want to call so-and-so. And they would unplug the line and plug it into the connection it needed to go to. And that's exactly how your thalamus operates. It's going to get sensory information like, oh, this is taste. It's going to go to the parietal lobe. This is sound. This is going to go to the temporal lobe. This is vision. It's going to go here. And it's going to relay all of these sensations from your special sensations to your more general sensations like touch and pressure. Send them to the proper areas of the cerebral cortex. Everything goes through the thalamus except for smell. Smell goes directly to the smell center of the brain in the medial aspect of your temporal lobe. It's very unique. Now, there are two thalami, two hemispheres essentially, in the center portion of your brain. And in some people, it is connected by gray matter called the inner thalamic adhesion. Some people have it, some people don't. So we really don't know what it does. Another aspect of the function of the thalamus is while it's relaying the specific sensation you're having, it's also letting you know in the moment if it's unpleasant or pleasant. So you've probably all had that moment, whether it's with pain or something maybe you smell or taste, where you're like, it's really good or it's really bad, but you don't know what it is. So maybe you stub your toe or hit a lower portion of your leg with something and you go, ow, like you knew something's hurt, but you can't pinpoint it until maybe a second later. That's your thalamus going, not pleasant, and then sending the information to the part of the brain that goes, ow, my toe, or ow, my shin. Now, here's an example of you only need to know what I have listed on the slides. Your thalamus has 1 million nuclei to it, and we're only learning 3 of them. You can see I have blacked out most of them. Most of these nuclei have the same function or combination of functions, and that they work with things like your limbic system, with emotions and memory, being aware, having consciousness. But the ones that we're primarily focused on, again, are getting us ready for our second to last chapter on pathways. So the 3 nuclei that we want to look at are the medial and lateral geniculate nuclei, which you'll be able to observe in lecture, and the ventral posterior nucleus, which is not something we can see in lab. I said lecture, I meant lab. So the lateral geniculate nucleus, we will see that in our last chapter. It's a major, sort of structure that we pass through for visual information. The medial geniculate nucleus is the same function, but for hearing information. And then the ventral posterior nucleus is where your information about maybe your forearm itches or that your arms are above your head is sent to the cerebral cortex. So hearing, vision, and sort of cutaneous sensation, those are going to be little pathway points that we'll be looking at in our second to last chapter. Now, inferior and a little anterior to your thalamus is your hypothalamus. Again, a million nuclei. Please ignore most of these. We're only going to look at three major structures here. The first one we're going to look at is the infundibulum. So here is my thalamus, here is my hypothalamus, here's my pituitary gland. The structure that connects the pituitary gland to the hypothalamus is your infundibulum. That's how we're going to have the neurons coming down, blood vessels, etc. for hormone secretion. The median eminence is a structure that's going to collect, it's not very easy to see because all the nuclei are in the way, but there's an area here that's going to basically have all of the secretions collect before they go into the portal system. And then we have our mammillary bodies, which is this guy right here, which is actually an important relay station for information from your limbic system structures, your amygdala and hippocampus, which we'll get into later, and the thalamus. Now, one structure I want to highlight, and I will highlight it for you because I did not have room on here to list it, is your suprachiasmatic nucleus. So this is the one nucleus that I do need you guys to learn, okay? And the reason we're going to talk about the suprachiasmatic nucleus is because it's related to melatonin. So this nucleus in particular is going to receive information from your eyes, particularly cranial nerve 2, which makes sense because, wow, it's really close. So your brain is going to receive information from your eyes about the amount of light. If there's a lot of light, like during the day, this nucleus is going to receive that information and cause the release of melatonin to decrease. Okay? That's why you are awake during the day. Your brain will receive information when it's nighttime, that the lights are out, it's dark, and it's going to ramp up melatonin production. And if you recall from our discussion on hormones, as your melatonin levels increase, you get tired, and then they decrease in the morning as you wake up. Okay, so that's sort of how that normal circadian rhythm works. That's why people that work night shift, you are sort of physically and mentally exhausted, but if you come home and try to sleep during the day without blackout curtains, it's very difficult for your body to know that it's time to go to sleep. Hey, here's our discussion of it. So again, here's that visual for you. We have our suprachiasmatic nucleus, and it's getting information. Ooh, it's sunny, and it says, hey, no more melatonin, pineal gland. And you go to sleep, or you don't go to sleep. And then at night, it goes, hey, it's really dark, pineal gland, please release melatonin, and it releases melatonin. So don't worry about a lot of this other stuff here. I just want you to understand what inhibits, what stimulates the production of melatonin. Huzzah. Now, overall, your hypothalamus has a huge laundry list of important things it does. We just talked about some of it before. So it's involved with your circadian rhythms. It's involved in, obviously, production and regulation of hormones. It controls your autonomic nervous system, things that you learn about in physiology. This is how you know you're thirsty. Your hypothalamus is monitoring your osmotic or osmolality of your brain plasma. It is letting you know you're hungry. It regulates your emotional patterns. It does a lot of stuff, so that's why it's incredibly important. It's not just one thing. It's not just the hormone thing. It's not just your thirsty part. It regulates a huge amount of your body's homeostasis. So like in general, this is your homeostasis area of the brain. All right, guys, last part. Sorry if it's a bit jumpy. I had to re-record this one part. This last part of our diencephalon, and the last thing that we're going to talk about today is our epithalamus. So the epithalamus is composed of a bunch of different nuclei. Again, we don't care. But the major component of your epithalamus is the pineal gland, which we talked about in our last unit on our discussion of the endocrine system. So the pineal gland, again, is important for the secretion of melatonin, which regulates your circadian rhythms by having that communication with the hypothalamus. Why we care right now, why I'm talking about it, is for my radiology tech students. The pineal gland calcifies. That's a very common thing to have happen, and we actually use it as a landmark on x-rays. So if you ever have to do an x-ray like this or a CT scan, etc., it will show up as calcified, super, super dense, and there it is. And now we can orient ourselves of where we're at in this image. So that's really all I have to say about your pineal gland. That's it for this second video. I will see you guys in the next one when we're going to cover the cerebrum, the cranial nerves, and all the other ancillary structures we haven't talked about yet. See you then.